Okay, so this video is a series of drawings that I'm going to guide you through. To start with, I would like you to just do something really simple. You can see on the table I have the vine charcoal, the compressed charcoal, the gum eraser, and the kneaded eraser. And I just want you to get a piece of newsprint. And I'm sitting in front of the still life, but I'm not really looking at the still life at this point. I'm just making a lot of different marks. I'm exploring different kinds of pressure. I'm twisting the charcoal. I'm laying it on its side. I want you, much like that tea drip drawing, I want you to explore different kinds of mark making. This is kind of me going kind of quickly. You can take your time and really try to come up with a vocabulary of marks. That tea drip drawing, what's so amazing about it is the variety, the natural variety of drawing. And throughout the course, I want you to keep exploring your mark making and try to enlarge your vocabulary. You can see I have different amounts of pressure, different values, whether it's light gray to dark, different widths of the line. Light pressure. And I'd like you to study those marks as you're making them. And then the next thing I want you to do, in this case I opened up the kneaded eraser. When you first use it, they really need to be stretched and worked almost like silly putty. If you ever played with it as a kid, a kneaded eraser is fun. All erasers. Erasers are not really used in the way that you might think of an eraser on the end of a pencil when you're in grade school. The kneaded eraser is a drawing tool. It's not just to remove material that was a mistake, but to make marks. And I'd like you to explore what you can do with a kneaded eraser. The vine charcoal is made out of willow, and it's very soft and easily removed and smudged. The compressed charcoals, as you can imagine, is compressed and is much denser. The erasers interact differently with each kind of charcoal. I'm now using the gum eraser, which again behaves differently than the kneaded eraser. So play with the lines, the mark making, the new kinds of marks you can make, smudging with the erasers, removing with the erasers, using your fingers. You can get that smooth black velvet. You can get that light gray. And now for this demo, for this drawing, I want you, this is really the first drawing of the still life in the class. I would like you to think of this as a quick 5-minute warm-up. You could set a timer if you wish. What I'm doing is I'm studying the still life, and I am trying to figure out the relationships between, say, a tree branch and the top of the cloth that's over a box. And just quick gestures. I'm not trying to reproduce what I'm seeing. I'm just trying to loosen up. It's my first drawing. I'm using the vine charcoal. And in some cases, like what I'm doing right now, is I'm not even lifting the charcoal at times. It's staying on the surface of the paper, and then I'm either pressing or slightly lifting up. Notice I'm attempting to not do little scratchy 1 millimeter lines of going back and forth to draw that line. One stroke, 1 3-inch stroke. Lift and then draw. So that mark has a certain intentionality to it. I've noticed many times in beginners when they're drawing and they don't feel confident, they'll take their pencil and they'll just do this little like 1 millimeter line at a time, most like a dotted line that's connected. And that's not a good way to begin. I want you to think of this much more fluid. Notice as I'm now starting to draw a darker shape down near the bottom of the drawing, that thicker black line starts to come forward. The thinner gray lines recede into the background. If you just look at my drawing, you'll notice there's now starting to be space through overlapping lines. And I'm using the still life as a guidance to know where those lines are supposed to go. And sometimes they're in the wrong place. And then I keep drawing and then I'm finding it. I'm erasing and I'm getting rid of where that line is not. And this is that quality of searching, of looking at that still life, trying to figure out the relationships of one edge to another edge, to the positive space, to the negative space between two different shapes, the edge of that leaf versus drawing the white space of the fabric in the background. Notice what might be very obvious to you, but the objects that's lower down on the bottom of the picture frame is closer. Things that are up near the top of the picture frame are further in the background. Even though this still life has a very shallow amount of literal space, maybe a foot or two, between the cloth that's in the furthest back, at the furthest distance from the picture plane, to the piece of wood that's the closest to the picture plane. Imagine that piece of newsprint as a piece of plexiglass, and that would be the picture plane that we're looking through. And we're saying that near the bottom of the page, that piece of wood is the closest thing to the picture plane. Up at the top, that little mark that hints at the gray of the curtain, that gray mark that hints at the curtain, is the thing that's furthest in the distance in this rather shallow spaced drawing. And I'm not trying to think so much about light and shadow in this drawing. I am attempting to get the relationships, the space between the tip of that wooden branch and the edge of that leaf. Is that negative space the right space that I am seeing? Am I also drawing it? So as a quick 5-minute drawing, we're not trying to reproduce reality. We're just looking at the process of looking and developing those relationships. Now this next drawing is also another 5-minute drawing, but this is called a contour drawing. And in this case, it's much slower. I am attempting to not look at the piece of paper that much. I'm actually looking down as little as possible, and I'm letting my eyes travel along the edge of that leaf or that piece of wood. Now, if you were going to do a really pure, strict contour drawing, you would never look down at the paper. In this case, I'm kind of doing a combination of looking at the contour drawing and attempting to get the shapes correct. And you can start to look at that line in the way that we were looking at the T-drips and think about the different amounts of pressure that you might be making. And there's times, if you just look carefully at that line that I have drawn so far, there's places where it's thicker, places where it's thinner, and that will actually start to develop a sense of three-dimensional space as to the edge of that leaf. And although the actual charcoal is not touching all four sides of the edges of the picture plane, the edges of the paper, I am thinking about that negative space all around the top of that leaf. So as you're drawing, I want you to think about the composition. How are you cropping this image? I don't expect you to draw the entire still life necessarily in every drawing. Maybe it's a close-up of a leaf and a piece of wood, and you would leave out the rest. And think about that frame as if you were taking a photograph, and you would be moving the camera to crop it just where you want it. Right? You're then thinking of that composition and the edges in relation to the objects. Now we're using newsprint to begin. One, because it's cheap and you can draw quickly and not worry about the cost of the paper, and hopefully it would free you up a little bit. The last drawing in my demo today, I'll use the better quality paper. But in this case, I've just been using newsprint today. And it's your choice, if you want to use the compressed charcoal or the vine charcoal. Both have their place. You should explore both. Explore different kinds of paper. But I hope this demo allows you to see what we were describing in the tea drips and the idea of line and shape in particular, and how using shape and line, you're actually doing both simultaneously. So every time I'm drawing a line, I'm drawing the shape that's on either side of that line. So students will say, oh, how do you draw a nose? How do you draw a leaf? Well, there is no way to draw a nose or a leaf. You're drawing the shape and the line of that leaf, of that nose. Anyone that has a shortcut, this is how you draw a nose, is not really drawing a nose. They're drawing a template, an idea of what a nose is. And in this case, I'm interested in you discovering and looking carefully at the line, at the shape. And there are times where you're trying to reproduce reality, and in that sense, the goal is to get that shape exact and those relationships exact. There are other times where you might use that as a starting point and become much more expressive and think about what it is that the shapes and the drawing itself is telling you. And as you can see this drawing so far, even where there are thick lines in the upper left-hand corner, the stem of that leaf sticking up is much thicker and darker, right? The edge of that piece of that stick just below it has a thick line that then gets thinner. Look carefully at what that's doing, how that's denoting the three-dimensionality of that piece of wood. And again, I would like this to be approximately a 5-minute drawing, so you need to work quickly. I want you within those 5 minutes to have your overall composition completed. I want you to design the whole page. Don't just focus on one little tip of the leaf for 5 minutes, but I would like a completed drawing in the sense that you're resolving the entire piece of paper. And now this last drawing that I'm going to show in this video is a 20-minute study, and I'm using a little better quality piece of paper. And I decided to start by just putting a gray, the edge of the charcoal, and putting just value down to get rid of that white piece of paper. Just smudge the whole thing. I find sometimes having that as a ground to draw on allows the negative spaces to have marks and to have life versus just being this cold white piece of paper. So by smudging that, I'll now draw on top of the gray ground and erase and remove material to build up positive space by almost sculpting that gray. And as we did in the other drawing, I'm attempting to just get the initial relationships. I'm making marks of just little places, like where is the end of that stem? How long is that stem in relation to the leaf? And then laying out the overall composition very quickly. You can always change it later. One of the beautiful things about charcoal is how forgiving it is. How easy it is to use the eraser and to remove material. You can see I'm attempting to find my way. I make a mark, you see I erase it. I'm trying to find that relationship between the edge of that one shape to the edge of the other. Is that the right distance? Is that roughly the negative space between those two shapes? And then as I'm going, I'm beginning to look at those marks that I'm making, pressing down to make that a thicker line, which gives it more dimension and more visual weight. Does that line push forward? Is that in the foreground? Should it be smudged and erased because it starts to go into the background? And notice by using that gray ground and now erasing it, that white shape, the negative space behind the stem of that leaf, has so much more life and visual interest than if it was just the plain piece of paper. Your eye, much like the tea drip example, because I'm not just using an outline, your eye can travel from the interior of that leaf along the stem and into the background negative space. Your eye navigates through the shapes as much as along the shapes. In this drawing, there's not just line and shape, but clearly starting to get value where the darkest dark, that velvety black that the charcoal can achieve, whether it's in a straight line or in that shape that's beginning to become the shadow of that leaf, there's a contrast. That the positive shape of the leaf pushes forward while the shadow drops backward. But once again, you're drawing the line between those two shapes. Think of the balance within the drawing. How's the drawing balanced? It could be symmetrical with equal amounts of shapes on all sides. It can be asymmetrically balanced. There could be a large shape on one side, but visually it's balanced, even though it's asymmetrical. And another thing for you to think about in this week's drawings is the sense of harmony and unity. How does this drawing have unity? Is it a repetition of shapes and values? Does it have a sense of harmony? What creates that harmony? That might be just a question for you to think about, and to think about within your own life. What does it mean to have harmony? When is harmony boring, and when is variety chaos? And how do you find the balance in your life and within your drawing? Those are some of the ideas that I'll have you comment on in the forum as part of our group discussion online. I think it's worth noting as well the sense of space that's developing. Just by that vertical dark line that's being drawn now, there's a sense of space that inherently pops forward because of the contrast. It feels much closer. It's also due to its position on the picture plane in the lower right-hand corner. It inherently feels closer than something's at the top of the picture plane. Combine that with the high contrast of the dark, the lighter, thinner gray up near the top, you get almost an atmospheric perspective just in gradation of grays. High contrast is going to pop. That edge is going to move forward. You smudge the edge of it, and that edge is going to move backward, further away in space. It's going to recede in space. So you'll see me sometimes smudging a line with my finger or drawing an eraser across it, and what that's doing is it's not as much as removing material that's a mistake as much as shaping that line, that contrast, and adjusting its contrast and actually moving it in space visually. As I draw that little dark shape right now underneath that curved piece of wood, that's sort of the shadow of the wood above. It creates space. It denotes the ground plane of the fabric on the tabletop. And again, it's about relationships. So it's the relationship of that black shape to the light shape, which represents the piece of wood above. The other thing to think about is I'm attempting to not draw in any one place in the drawing for any length of time. I'm trying to resolve the entire drawing, the entire picture plane, the composition and the values holistically, because they're relationships. So I'm moving from one place up to another and thinking about its relationship in the actual space of the still life and in the design, composition, and mark making in the drawing. And by adding this value at the bottom, these values of gray, various shades of gray, representing the shadow and the surface of the cloth, it helps define the flat plane of the tabletop with the cloth on top. It gives a sense of that dimensionality. Excuse me. The darker value in the foreground really starts to bring that forward, allowing the negative spaces between the tree branches and the edge of the leaf to recede further back in space. And again, this is a very shallow spaced still life. Not much depth overall. In the literal space, we're only talking 24 to 36 inches tops. But within the drawing, it makes all the difference in sort of representing and developing that sense of three-dimensionality. I'm also attempting at this drawing to not represent the light as much. That's something we can do a little more later. I'm attempting to use the light only to help me see the three-dimensionality. I mean, occasionally I am drawing the shadows, and it does sort of create three-dimensionality, but it's the structure of the tree branches and of the leaves that I'm interested in, not the surface of the light on not the light on the surface of the objects. I hope that makes sense. This is not a study about the lighting. The lighting is helping us discover the structure and the distances and the relationships between the objects. And here the value on the surface of the leaf is attempting to get the three-dimensionality, the sort of shaped, the three-dimensional bended, the bended shapes of the leaves. It bends in space. It's not a flat plane. That folded thin leaf is almost like a facet, and if you can get those shapes, you'll start to actually represent the three-dimensional quality of that leaf. And again, it's like putting that gray down to begin with, that gray surface before we even started the drawing. I'm sculpting that leaf with the eraser. Taking that kneaded eraser and pulling the charcoal away in a subtractive method rather than an additive method. It's like sculpting in clay versus stone, right? You could add with the clay and remove with the chisel. And so I'm removing charcoal to bring out the shape of the leaf. So it's a subtractive process at times. So the whole drawing is a combination of additive and subtractive. Additive and subtractive processes throughout. What's the direction of that line? The repetition of the line being erased, the lines that are being made by the eraser. How does that line of the eraser, that sort of fat, fuzzy line, relate to the sharper, darker line of the compressed charcoal? And I think the other thing I want to just mention before we finish this drawing is the idea that it's a process. It's a process of discovery, of finding your way, false start, erasing, refinding your way. It's successful, you move on. It's an additive and subtractive process of discovery, of looking, of massaging those marks, of erasing that shape because it isn't quite in the right place. Notice what mark is in the foreground, what mark is in the background. Is there a middle ground in your drawing? Do you have a foreground, middle ground, background? Are there openings within the shape so that how does your eye navigate? If you look at that leaf on the upper left-hand corner of the drawing, the dark stem and the edge of the leaf, that little V shape, it's open, and your eye can travel from the negative space into the interior of the leaf, down along the dark tree branch, maybe up into the white tree branch that goes up to the upper right-hand corner, to the leaf in the upper right-hand corner. So now you can see that drawing. I'm smudging the last little bits to push that into the foreground, to bring it forward spatially. So that sort of wraps up this 20-minute quick drawing, this study